Today I am painting this broad build mott. So just dipping my brush in some clean water and brushing the water onto the bird. And this is a water brush, so you can dip it in the water or you can put water in and squeeze it out. Usually I only put water in it and squeeze it out if I am out of the house, traveling or whatnot, because it's easier than having a cup of water. But when I am home, I usually have my my cups of water, one for clean, one for dirty, and I just dip it like any other brush. At this point I am doing the head and the belly, avoiding the eye and the wing area. And sometimes I do have to tilt it a little bit so that I can see which parts I have already wet. Starting by adding some water to my yellow. Still a pretty thick mix though at this point. And putting that on the bird's head. Getting into my green now. As you can see, that is a darker green, so I am adding some yellow to it to make it a more of a lime green color. I got some paint where I didn't want it. If that happens to you, you can use a clean paper towel and just dot it up while it's still wet. And of course, between switching colors, I clean my brush off. Now getting a little bit of my brown. Adding just a little yellow to it. And you can always test your colors out on a piece of scrap paper before putting them on your painting if you are uncertain if you have the color that you are going for. So adding in a little more yellow, touch of that green that I had mixed up previously. Keep getting some water drips on my brush that I have to keep wiping off, because I don't want them landing somewhere on my painting, somewhere where I don't want messing it up. Straight into some of that brown now. And I am doing all of this wet on wet, dropping my paint into the water that I had put down previously. Adding a little fluff to his head. dropping in some thicker paint here. You can make the colors more vibrant by adding less water, and you can make them lighter by adding more water. Sometimes you just have to experiment a little bit to see how you want it to look. And I am just re-wetting some of this area. It was drying faster than I wanted it to. This was a warm day while I was painting this bird, and my water was drying pretty quickly. So again, into my lime green color there. You can see how light the color looks. That is because that has a little more water added to it now. And I'm kind of just dotting this paint into the water that I had already laid down on this bird, dotting it in to try and create some kind of a texture. A little more green, adding it to that previous mix of lime green to make it just a little darker, and going in and dotting that around now as well on the belly. Adding some little striped areas there with that same green, and just dotting a little more in. I always like to try and create some texture on birds and animals, since they do, if you look at them, they do have a lot of texture in their feathers and fur. And you can see how wet it is there. I decided to go in and add some salt. So salt can be a little tricky. You don't want it to be too wet or too dry when you add the salt. And if you have puddles of water, you may want to wait. But if it's just barely shiny, that might not be wet enough. So adding salt to your watercolors can add some texture, as you will see here when it dries. So once you are done adding the salt, you will need to let it dry completely. So once that has dried, you can scrape the salt off. I'm still careful when I do this. I try not to apply too much pressure. And as you can see here in just a moment, you can see the texture there that salt creates. And I just love the effect that it has. So going in now to the wing, I'm going to be wetting the wing. Don't know, my dog, if you can hear her, my dog is laying next to me snoring. So just getting that wing nice and wet. Like I said, trying to avoid puddles, but just a good even layer of water. And going into my yellow and mixing it with that green color I had mixed previously. Just covering the wing with that color. And applying now to the tail. Watercolor is all about layers, so you can start with a light layer and then keep going on top of it until you have the look that you want. Making sure there's no salt on the face. Going into my darker blue, getting a good thick mix of that, just a little water and a lot of my paint. So with this, I did not wet that area first, just going in wet on dry. So that's wet paint on dry paper. A little more of that color, a little bit of the lighter blue, dropping into that darker color. So now I'm going into my black. Adding some brown to it. And getting a little bit of that to tackle the beak. And there's a hair in my paintbrush. Decided I wanted a little bit of blue in that color. So just a little bit of blue. If you have pets, I think it's inevitable that you are going to get hairs in your paintbrush. You're going to have to pick out occasionally. So I'm starting with the bottom half of the beak. They're going into the face a little bit. So getting some brown. Getting a little bit of that black mixture I had done for the beak, adding a little bit of it to my brown. Picking more hairs out of my brush. So if the blue part is not yet dry when you are doing this, be very careful not to touch it because the two colors will bleed together if you do. So if you're worried about that, you may want to wait until that is completely dry. And as usual with my eyes, I do try and leave the white of the paper showing through for that white shine in the eye. So going back with some very thick green at this point with a lot of paint and just a little bit of water. I think I decided I needed just a little more water with that. And adding some yellow. Not as much yellow as I did for the lime green, but just a little bit of yellow this time. And of course, you can play with your mixes and play with these colors until you get something that you like and you feel looks good. I've painted this bird a few times at this point, and I think each time I do it a little bit differently. So adding just a touch more yellow in there. Adding some of the details on the wing. Adding a little more yellow to my mix again. And sometimes it's not in the in camera, but sometimes if I feel like my paintbrush is just a little too wet, I will dab it just a little bit on a paper towel. So just going through, adding this color, but still letting some of that color underneath show through. Now I'm back to my darker mix. And doing the top of the beak. At this point, the bottom part of the beak should be dry. And I've added a little more water to this now to make it a little bit lighter for the top of the beak. Of course, mine was drying quickly because of the weather, so if yours isn't dry, you might want to give it a couple more minutes before doing this part. Adding some more black to that mix. Getting some of my darker blue and mixing it with that black. Doing the bit around the eye. And make sure your eye is dry before doing this. I do sometimes get impatient and do it before it's dry, but that's always a little dangerous. And I always feel like once that eye area is done, the bird really starts to come to life. So adding just a little more black to that mix. Now I'm back to my green, getting a good amount of thick paint on my brush and going back into the wing. And I'm now adding some of those feather details. And also taking some of that green and adding more details along the top of the wing. Adding some details right above the feathers on the wing. And there I just have some clean water on my brush, and I am pulling that paint up a little bit and moving it so there is not a harsh line, and to add a little more color to the rest of the wing. And I'm doing the same thing with some of that detail that I did previously. And I'm drying some drips off my paper. So now I just have clean water, and I'm going in and blurring those lines a little bit that I had put in there, just to try and make them look a little more natural. And also it moves that color around to those feathers. You don't want to blur it out completely, just a little bit of water and some light pressure to move that color around a little bit. As you can see, I'm looking at my painting, figuring out what I need next. Put a little more thick green on, and I am going in again to the wing. Got some of my dark green again, or I should say thick green, and going down the tail now. Getting a little bit of brown, not extremely thick. Adding just a little more to make it a little bit thicker there, and going along the belly. Picking up some more thick brown there. And there again, I have some clean water on my brush, and I am just taking some of that paint with my clean water and blurring that line and moving a little bit of that color up the bird's belly. This just blends it out a little bit, makes it a little more natural, and takes away any harsh edges there might have been. Adding a little green detail around there. Going back in with my yellow and adding some more of that along the belly. And at this point it is a little damp because of how I was moving that, that brown color previously. Going into the green mix I had made previously and just dotting some of that in. That is some green mixed with a little bit of yellow. So this is just green here that I am going in, adding a few more details here, kind of adding a dark line around the wing to separate it from the body a little bit more. And again, just kind of blurring that line out just a little bit. Getting another thick brown on my brush and going along the top of the head. A little bit more on his back there. And again, going in with some clean water and just blurring that line. Picking up some thick yellow and going back into his, I guess it would be his chin area. A little more yellow for right there by the beak. And along the head, underneath the brown. Back to my green. And I'm just dotting that in above that darker eye color. So I'm just dotting in a little bit of brown here. Kind of with a stippling, it's just the tip of my brush. Trying to add a little texture there. And there I've got green with just a touch of yellow, and I am stippling that in as well along the wing. And I just continue to do that in different areas where I think it needs it. Again, going along those detailed feathers a little more. Going in with some thick green along the top there, the top part of the wing. And you can see how thick this is because it's very dark. So that is a lot of paint with very little water. Doing the same amount of paint there. Just going over a few more of those lines to have a little more contrast. Also going in with just some clean water and dotting that in a little bit, just to kind of blur those lines and make sure there's a little texture there. Also going over some of those wing lines that I put in again and blurring those out just a little. A little light green down the tail again. And some brown at the base of the, I guess at the base of the bird, right there near the tail. And blurring that out a little, stippling that. So getting a little bit of the black there, but it's very watered down. Notice that the top of the beak was a little lighter than I wanted it, so I decided to add another layer of that and try and darken it just a little bit. So I got just a little bit of the darker blue color, not very watered down there, very thick, and I'm adding a little more on top of that blue. I'm getting some brown and mixing it in with some of the black that I had on my palette. And I'm going in to do the legs. And sometimes I look at a color and think it needs something, so at this point I decided to add a little bit of blue to that brown and black mix that I had made. And a little touch of brown there, then I go back in. So the feet I thought were a little dark for my liking, so I took a clean paper towel and just dabbed them very carefully. You don't want to smear, you just kind of want to dab. And it removed a little bit of that paint, and then I went back in with just my brown color. While the watercolor is still wet, that is something you can do if you put something down and think that you do not like it, or it's too bright or too dark. You can often go in and remove some of that paint with a clean paper towel, or you can go in with a damp brush. You don't want it sopping wet, just damp, and pick up some of the color. So now I am wetting the perch that the bird is standing on. Going in with some brown there. Until I added some water to it. It's maybe a medium mix. It's not thick, but it's not super watered down. And I'm just being very careful around the feet. You may want to let the feet dry before doing that part. So once again, I am mixing some black, some brown, and I did put a touch of purple in it this time. And I'm just adding that here and there along the branch. Adding a little bit more. I picked up some brown and added just a little bit of that dark mix to it to have another shade that I can add in there to my branch. And that's some clean water. I decided to pick up a little bit of that color there. So I just got a little clean water on my brush and started brushing some areas with it. Picked up some more of my dark color I mixed up, adding that in. Trying to especially put that underneath the bird so it looks a little more shadowed where the bird is standing. And that's just some brown that I am adding to it now. So as you can see, I'm looking at the bird, trying to figure out what I might need to do next, and decided to just blur that line there a little bit with some water. Then I'm adding a little more of a thick yellow to that head area. I just got a touch of thick black on my brush to add to a few places on the perch, to add some of the, I guess fingernails, I'll call them, to the bird with that color. Talons, maybe. Maybe that's it. So now I'm going in with some white gouache, and I'm adding a few highlight areas. Starting with just a very thin little highlight on the bird's legs and feet. And a little highlight on his head. And as you can see, I'm going in, and I am trying to do some very quick, small strokes to the head to add some texture while I'm putting it on there. Of course, I'm doing longer strokes on the tail to try and make it look like feathers. And adding just a little bit of that to the feathers on the wing. And this is just adding a little more in a few places, just to make a few areas pop. And that is about it for this bird.